Welcome my channel. Today, we're uncovering one of the darkest and most shocking true stories buried in American history. This is Thanksgiving Bloodshed. Samson, the slave who snapped his master's neck. A single holiday meal, meant for gratitude and peace, turned into a moment of sudden, irreversible violence that stunned an entire community. This story is reconstructed from plantation records, court mentions, and oral accounts that took deep, careful research to uncover. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And make sure to subscribe, because bringing these forgotten true stories to light takes a huge amount of work, time, and verification, and your support helps keep real history alive. Samson's life before Thanksgiving of 1857 was shaped by violence long before he ever raised his hands against another man. Born into slavery on a small but notoriously harsh plantation, he never knew a day of freedom or safety. From childhood, his body was valued more than his humanity. He was unusually strong even as a boy, broad-shouldered and resilient, and that strength made him useful, and therefore punished. Overseers worked him harder than others, believing pain would break his spirit and turn his power into obedience. Instead, it quietly hardened something inside him. By the time Samson reached adulthood, his reputation was well known. He was the man sent to clear the toughest land, haul the heaviest loads, and endure punishments others couldn't survive. Whippings were common, sometimes for reasons as small as slowing his pace or lifting his head when spoken to. Yet Samson rarely cried out. Witnesses later said that what unsettled them most wasn't his silence, but his eyes, steady, watchful, as if he were counting every blow. In a world where enslaved people were stripped of control, memory became one of the few weapons left to him. The master who owned Samson was a man feared even by neighboring plantation owners. He was known for discipline that bordered on cruelty and a temper that flared without warning, especially when drinking. Samson was often made an example of, beaten publicly to remind others of their place. Over time, these punishments escalated. Food was withheld. Rest was denied. On several occasions, Samson was locked in a shed overnight, injured and bleeding, only to be forced back into the fields at dawn. No doctor was ever called for him. His survival was expected, not valued. Despite this, Samson formed quiet bonds with others on the plantation. At night, when exhaustion blurred the pain, he listened to whispered stories of Africa, of freedom, of men who ran and were never seen again. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were measured. Some remembered him saying once, "A man can only bend so far before he breaks or snaps back." At the time, no one thought much of it. Such thoughts were dangerous, and survival depended on silence. As Thanksgiving approached in 1857, the plantation atmosphere changed. For the master, the holiday was a celebration of abundance and authority. Enslaved people were forced to prepare the feast, slaughtering animals, cooking food they would barely taste. Samson was assigned the heaviest work, hauling firewood, lifting barrels, and serving tables under the watchful eyes of the master and his guests. Alcohol flowed freely, and with it came mockery and cruelty disguised as holiday humor. Orders were barked louder, insults sharper. That week, something shifted in Samson. Those close to him later said he barely slept. He ate little, staring into the distance during the few moments of rest he had. The master had singled him out repeatedly, humiliating him in front of guests, forcing him to kneel and serve, reminding him publicly that strength meant nothing without permission. At one point, the master reportedly joked that Samson's neck looked strong enough to hold a yoke forever. Laughter followed. Samson did not laugh. What no one at the table understood was that Samson's breaking point had not come suddenly. It had been built over years, every scar, every insult, every night spent bleeding in the dark. Thanksgiving was not the cause, it was merely the stage. The violence that would follow was born long before the feast, long before the table was set. It grew quietly in a man denied every human boundary until only one remained, the line between enduring and acting. On that plantation, Samson had learned the rhythms of cruelty. He knew when the master drank too much, when his guards were distracted, when arrogance made him careless. The holiday created the perfect illusion of control, the belief that fear was permanent and unbreakable. But beneath that illusion stood a man who had been treated as an object for so long that the consequences no longer outweighed the suffering. By the morning of Thanksgiving, Samson was already living in a different state of mind. To him, the day was not about gratitude or survival. It was about finality. Whether he lived or died after it no longer mattered. What mattered was that the years of pain would end, one way or another. And so, as the plantation gathered to celebrate, no one noticed that Samson had already crossed a line they could never pull him back from. The Thanksgiving gathering of 1857 was meant to be a display of power, order, and celebration, but beneath the polished surface, tension hung thick in the air. From early morning, the plantation buzzed with forced activity. Enslaved men and women moved quickly between the kitchen, the yard, and the main house, knowing that mistakes on a day like this would be punished more harshly than usual. The master wanted everything perfect. Thanksgiving was not just a holiday for him. It was a performance, a chance to show his wealth, control, and authority to neighboring guests. Samson was placed at the center of that performance. He was ordered to handle the most visible tasks, hauling heavy trays, standing guard near the dining room, pouring drinks, lifting furniture when guests requested more space. He was never allowed to step out of sight. Every movement was watched. Every pause earned a sharp command. The master seemed to take special pleasure in keeping Samson close, as if displaying a prized possession whose strength proved his dominance. As the guests arrived, laughter filled the house. But it was a cruel kind of laughter. Jokes were made at Samson's expense about his size, his silence, his endurance. One guest reportedly asked how many men it would take to restrain him if he ever forgot himself. The master laughed and said one rope would be enough. Samson stood still, eyes forward, hands clenched just enough to feel the bones press together. Each word landed like another invisible blow. Alcohol flowed freely. With every drink, the master grew louder, bolder, more careless. He barked orders for Samson to move faster, then mocked him for moving too quickly. At one point, he deliberately spilled wine and ordered Samson to clean it with his bare hands while guests watched. The humiliation was deliberate. It wasn't punishment for wrongdoing, it was entertainment. Samson knelt, scrubbing the floor as laughter echoed above him. Those nearby later said his breathing was slow and controlled, as if he were holding something back. The meal itself stretched on for hours. Plates were refilled, glasses raised, and stories told of success and conquest. Samson remained standing the entire time. His legs trembled from exhaustion, but he was not permitted to sit. When a guest asked why such a strong man looked tired, The master responded by striking Samson across the back of the neck with the flat of his hand, calling it a reminder of proper posture. The sound was sharp. The room fell briefly quiet. Samson straightened, said nothing, and resumed his position. That silence was what unsettled some of the guests. Others later claimed they felt something shift in that moment. Samson did not look angry in the way they expected. There was no outburst, no visible defiance. Instead, his expression went blank, calm in a way that felt unnatural. His eyes no longer followed orders, they watched people, measured, assessing, as if he were no longer part of the room, but standing just outside it, looking in. The master, emboldened by the attention, continued. He began boasting about discipline, about how fear was the only language men, like Samson, understood. He placed a hand on Samson's shoulder, squeezing hard, showing off the muscle beneath the skin. All this strength, he said, and not a drop of will. More laughter followed. Samson did not react, but those close enough noticed his jaw tighten, his shoulders stiffen, not in resistance, but in resolve. As the evening wore on, the guards relaxed. They leaned against walls, distracted by drink and conversation. The master's confidence grew. He believed the setting itself, holiday, guests, celebration, made him untouchable. Samson noticed everything: the spacing of the room, the placement of chairs, the way the master stood when he talked, always turning his back just slightly, always assuming obedience. By the time dessert was served, the tension had become invisible to most in the room, masked by laughter and excess. But for Samson, the gathering had narrowed into something sharp and focused. Every insult, every blow, every command had aligned into a single moment of clarity. The humiliation of that day was not new, it was familiar. What was different was Samson's certainty that there would not be another. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a reminder of order. Instead, it became the final proof to Samson that nothing would ever change. The celebration had stripped away any remaining illusion of mercy or restraint. What remained was a crowded room, a careless master, and a man who had already decided that the suffering would end, no matter the cost. The moment itself happened so quickly that many of the guests later disagreed on what they had seen. 1 second, the room was filled with voices, clinking glasses, and forced laughter. The next, it was as if time fractured. Samson was standing just behind the master, close enough to serve him, close enough to hear his slurred words as he turned to boast once more about control, obedience, and strength. The master laughed loudly, gesturing with his drink, unaware of how exposed he was. That carelessness would be the last thing he ever carried. Samson did not shout. He did not hesitate. Those who survived said there was no rage on his face, no wild movement that could be mistaken for madness. What they saw instead was precision. Years of lifting, hauling, and surviving had given him an understanding of bodies that no doctor ever taught him. In a single motion, he stepped forward, one arm locking around the master's neck, the other bracing his shoulder. There was a sharp, unmistakable sound, not loud, but final, like wood snapping under pressure. The master's drink shattered on the floor as his body went limp. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Silence swallowed the room. Some guests stood frozen, mouths open, unable to process what had just occurred. Others thought it was a joke gone too far, a demonstration meant to scare. But then they saw the master's eyes, unfocused, lifeless, and the truth settled like ice in their chests. The most powerful man in the room was dead, killed not by a weapon, but by the hands of the man he believed he owned. Samson did not run. He did not strike anyone else. He lowered the body carefully to the floor, as if placing something heavy down after a long day's work. That detail haunted witnesses for the rest of their lives. There was no triumph in his movements, no celebration, only calm, only stillness. One woman later said it looked as though Samson had finally finished a task he had been carrying for years. Screams followed. Chairs scraped back. Someone dropped a plate that shattered against the wall. A guard reached for his pistol, but froze when Samson turned to face the room. He did not threaten them. He did not speak. He simply stood there, breathing steadily, his hands relaxed at his sides. The fear in the room was immediate and overwhelming. In that moment, everyone understood something they had never allowed themselves to believe before. The illusion of absolute control was gone. Several guests fled the house, running into the yard in panic. Others backed away slowly, unsure whether Samson would attack again. He didn't. He looked down at the master's body one last time, then raised his eyes to the people watching him. Witnesses later said that look was not hatred. It was something colder, something resolved. It was the look of a man who knew exactly what the rest of his life would cost and had already accepted the price. The guards eventually moved in, but cautiously, as if approaching a wild animal. Samson offered no resistance. When they bound his wrists, he did not struggle. One of them reportedly asked why he did it. Samson's answer was quiet, almost lost in the chaos. Because it was done to me first. No one responded. There was nothing to say. Outside, the plantation erupted into confusion. Enslaved workers watched from a distance, unable to look away, but afraid to move. They had heard the snap. They had seen the guests scatter. Word spread in whispers, faster than any alarm bell could ring. Some felt terror, knowing what punishment would follow. Others felt something they had never felt before, not hope exactly, but recognition. Proof that the master was not untouchable. Proof that fear could break. Inside the house, the master's body lay where it had fallen, bloodless, undramatic, stripped of authority in death. The feast was abandoned. Food spoiled on the table. The holiday ended not with prayer or gratitude, but with a truth no one there would ever forget. Violence had entered the room not as chaos, but as consequence. By nightfall, Samson was locked away, guards posted, decisions already forming about his fate. But even as chains closed around him, the silence he left behind was louder than any scream. The plantation would never return to what it had been. That single act, sudden, controlled, irreversible, shattered the fragile order that had defined the place for decades. Thanksgiving of 1857 was meant to celebrate power. Instead, it exposed its weakness. In one moment, the world the master built ended at the hands of the man who carried its weight the longest. And no matter what came next for Samson, that moment could never be undone. The immediate aftermath was chaos wrapped in fear. For several long seconds after the master's body hit the floor, no one seemed able to breathe. Then the room erupted. Guests shouted over one another, some screaming for guards, others demanding to leave at once. Chairs overturned, doors slammed, and boots thundered down the porch steps as men fled into the yard. Thanksgiving had collapsed into panic, and the house that moments earlier symbolized authority now felt unsafe, contaminated by what had just happened. Inside, those who remained moved carefully, as if any sudden motion might provoke Samson. But he did nothing. He stood where he was, wrists empty, posture straight, eyes steady. That calm frightened people more than violence ever could. Guards approached with weapons drawn, but slowly, uncertainly. They expected resistance. They expected fury. Instead, Samson offered none. When they bound him, he lowered his hands without a word. One guard later admitted that if Samson had chosen to fight, no one in that room could have stopped him. That realization spread quickly, deepening the terror. The master's body was carried away in silence. There was no ceremony, no dignity, only urgency. Someone ordered the windows shut. Another demanded the gates be locked. Whispers flew about what must be said, what must never be repeated. The guests who had laughed earlier now argued about responsibility. Some insisted the story be controlled before it reached neighboring plantations. Others feared retaliation, rebellion, or worse, that the enslaved workers had witnessed too much. Outside, the enslaved community sensed the shift immediately. They hadn't seen everything, but they heard enough: the snap, the screams, the running feet. Word spread in fragments. No one celebrated, no one shouted. Instead, people gathered in tight clusters, exchanging looks heavy with understanding and dread. They knew what would come next. History had taught them that violence against a master, no matter the cause, would be met with swift and brutal punishment. Fear returned, thick and familiar. But beneath it ran something else, an unspoken recognition that the unthinkable had happened. That night, the plantation locked itself down. Patrols doubled. Fires burned late as men argued in low voices. Letters were drafted and redrafted, deciding how to report the death. An accident. A fit. Anything but the truth. Some urged blaming illness or drunken collapse. Others wanted to claim Samson attacked without warning, painting him as a monster rather than a man pushed beyond endurance. The goal was clear: protect the system. Protect the image. Protect themselves. Samson was isolated, placed in a makeshift cell under constant watch. Those assigned to guard him kept their distance. No one taunted him. No one struck him. There was a sense that crossing him again might invite something worse. When questioned, Samson answered simply, without anger or apology. He did not ask for mercy. He did not offer explanations beyond a few quiet words. His composure unsettled even those tasked with breaking him. By morning, riders were sent to nearby authorities. The story traveled ahead of them, altered with every mile. In some versions, Samson was a savage brute. In others, a traitor who had planned rebellion. Rarely was the truth spoken that a man endured years of abuse and finally acted in a moment shaped by cruelty and opportunity. Fear demanded simplification, and so the narrative was sharpened into something easier to punish. The guests who escaped carried the memory with them, and it haunted them. Some swore never to return to the plantation. Others drank to forget the sound they heard. A few tried to justify what they had witnessed, clinging to the belief that order would be restored, that examples would be made, that fear would return to its proper place. But something had shifted. They had seen power fail, not in chaos, but in quiet decisiveness. Within days, the plantation bore the marks of control reasserted: more guards, harsher rules, heavier silence. Yet the atmosphere never recovered. Conversations stopped when footsteps approached. Eyes lingered longer than before. People remembered. Even as the system closed ranks and prepared its response, the shock lingered like a crack in stone, small, but impossible to erase. What happened after the act mattered as much as the act itself. The cover, ups, the fear, the rushed decisions, all revealed how fragile authority truly was. One man's death had exposed a truth. No one there could unknow control depended on belief, and belief could be broken. Thanksgiving ended not with gratitude, but with a reckoning that spread far beyond that single room, settling into the land, the people, and the stories they would carry in silence for generations. What followed Samson's act was not just punishment, but erasure. Authorities moved quickly, not only to deal with him, but to make sure the story itself did not grow legs. Official records were brief and deliberately vague. Samson was reduced to a line in a ledger, described as violent, unruly, and disposed of according to law. The manner of his death, whether execution, extrajudicial killing, or quiet disappearance, was never clearly recorded. That uncertainty was intentional. Clear endings create martyrs. Silence creates forgetting. In the weeks after Thanksgiving, the plantation resumed its routines, but nothing truly returned to normal. A new overseer was brought in. Rules were tightened. Public punishments increased, meant to remind everyone that the system still held power. Yet those measures had the opposite effect among the enslaved. Fear remained, but it was no longer pure. It had been complicated by memory. People remembered that for one moment, power had snapped. That memory did not inspire open rebellion. It inspired quiet endurance mixed with something dangerous imagination. Samson's name was not spoken openly, but it traveled anyway. Whispered in cabins late at night, passed between plantations by those who visited or were sold away. Each retelling changed slightly, but the core remained the same: a man pushed beyond all limits who chose action over submission. In some versions, Samson died screaming. In others, he walked calmly to his end. In a few, he escaped into the woods and was never caught. The truth mattered less than what the story represented. He became less a person and more a symbol, proof that obedience was not natural and fear was not permanent. Among the white families who had witnessed or heard of the event, the reaction was different but equally telling. Some refused to speak of it again. Others framed it as a cautionary tale, warning that cruelty invited danger. Plantation owners debated discipline methods, not out of compassion, but calculation. A few quietly reduced the worst abuses, not because they believed it was wrong, but because they feared creating another Samson. In that sense, his act altered behavior more than any law ever did. Over time, the official version hardened into folklore, stripped of context. Samson became the savage slave. In some retellings, his years of abuse erased. In others, he was barely mentioned at all, replaced by sanitized stories of accidents or illness. Thanksgiving records from that year disappeared or were altered. Guests who had been present rarely spoke of it publicly, and when they did, their accounts conflicted. History, as it often does, bent toward comfort rather than truth. But among the descendants of the enslaved, Samson's story endured differently. He was remembered not as a hero in the romantic sense, but as a warning and a reminder. A warning of how far cruelty can push a human being. A reminder that resistance does not always look noble or safe, but it is still human. Elders told younger generations that Samson's strength was not just in his body, but in his refusal to accept endless humiliation as his destiny. As decades passed and slavery ended, the plantation itself declined. Buildings rotted, fields changed hands. New owners avoided talking about its past. Yet locals claimed the land never felt right again. Thanksgiving was no longer celebrated there. Some said it was superstition. Others said it was memory settling into the soil. Places where violence breaks illusion tend to carry a residue that no amount of time fully clears. Historians would later stumble across fragments of the story, court notes, second-hand letters, contradictory accounts, and struggle to piece them together. Many dismissed it as exaggerated or symbolic. But the consistency of one detail across versions stood out: the suddenness of the act and the silence that followed. Not chaos, not frenzy, silence. That detail is what gives the story its weight. It suggests intention, not madness, decision, not impulse. Today, Samson's name rarely appears in textbooks. His story doesn't fit neatly into narratives of passive suffering or clean moral arcs. It forces uncomfortable questions about responsibility, violence, and the human breaking point. It asks whether a system built on cruelty can truly claim innocence when it creates the conditions for its own undoing. Those are questions many histories prefer to avoid. Yet the legacy remains, even if unspoken. Every time the story is rediscovered, it unsettles people, not because of the violence itself, but because of its clarity. Samson did not lash out blindly. He acted at a moment when power assumed it was untouchable. That fact challenges the idea that oppression is stable or inevitable. It reminds us that systems rely on belief as much as force, and belief can fracture. In the end, Samson did not live to see change. He did not escape punishment. But his act outlived him in ways his oppressors could not control. It survived in whispers, in altered behavior, in buried records that still refuse to stay buried. Thanksgiving of 1857 became more than a date. It became a fault line. And though history tried to smooth it over, the crack is still there, reminding anyone who looks closely that even the most rigid systems can break, and when they do, the sound echoes far longer than anyone expects.